Hello, my name is Bálint BALÁZS from the Environmental Social Science Research Group, Hungary. And in this presentation, I would like to give an overview of our policy analysis, which has been done in a project called TRUE, which is standing for Transition Path to Sustainable Legume-based Systems in Europe. And in the policy analysis that we performed, we'd like to concentrate on the most important insights about reorienting the focus of policies on legume-based food and feed systems.
Our main objective was to analyze and enable policies and regulatory systems for the promotion of legumes. This was divided into 4 subtasks. Task number 1 was to identify and characterize legume-friendly policies as well as main drivers for such policy change. Task number 2 was to host stakeholder workshops for new ideas and innovations for progressive governance solutions. Task number 3 was to provide stakeholders with new institutional and policy frameworks for the governance of legume-based farming systems and also consumption and production patterns. Finally, task number 4 was to raise awareness of the positive roles of legumes in the human diet and agricultural production. Our first report on the co-design of the policy analysis was submitted in the first reporting period. This report pointed out that the low profitability of legumes cannot be fully counterbalanced through the price support or economic incentives. It also pointed out that there is a need for novel socio-technical innovations where state and non-state actors can join to lead the transition towards more legume-based food systems. The report also showed that there needs to be an increase in farmers' knowledge in managing rotations and also using less mineral fertilizers. Also, there is a need to demonstrate ecological benefits of legumes as well as health and nutrition benefits of legumes. There is also a need to develop supply chain capacities and food innovations at the local and regional scale to create new outlets for legumes. Overall, this report is pointing out that there is a need for a more enabling policy environment, which is combining several instruments from the agricultural policies and also other policy domains, including, for example, the greening measures or investment in research and innovation, and also a ban on the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. After this scan of the previous reports and the already available literature on legume-based food innovation and policy development, we looked at different case studies in a report about the co-production of the policy assessment. Within this report, we used an interpretative policy framework that looked at the context of the policies, but also at the content level of various legal documents and also the processes around the formulation of policies. On this background, we produced the evaluation of the European level policies and also looked at various policy case studies in 8 countries. These country studies highlighted various policy challenges and innovations at different points of the legume value chains. In the second report on the policy assessment, we came to the conclusions that for legume-focused innovation, the primary hindrance is actually the inconsistencies among policies. This incoherence on the policy landscape is exemplified by the following components. First, protein strategies where they exist, are usually oriented towards industrial livestock production. Agricultural policy, including the Common Agricultural Policy, greening, and voluntary coupled schemes, is very effective, but not in general, only in different ways in different countries. Also, we found that despite the activity of the research and innovation sector regarding legumes, a lack of knowledge transfer becomes the common problem. Also, we contended that there are only very few governance solutions which are already there with a proven effect on increasing homegrown legume consumption. We also found that within consumer policies, health and nutrition are becoming the leading domains, and they are really gaining increasing acknowledgement. Despite this momentum, their focus is very far from legumes. Finally, we found that trade policy, as it exists now in the world, created mutual interdependencies, and in terms of legumes, the demand by China is leading the soy production and also the trading prices all over the world. So in the next step of our policy assessment, we've been trying to look at what's behind this low level of consumption and production of legumes in Europe. So we developed a Delphi Questionnaire that was looking at favorable governance contexts to collate anonymous opinions from stakeholders. This Delphi Questionnaire run with a panel of geographically dispersed policy experts. Altogether, 80 expert panel members were assessing 10 food policy areas. These are the main components of what we called the legume paradox. And we asked them to develop favorable policies and transition pathways iteratively in this Delphi study. What we found in the first round is a complicated and interconnected web of the arguments behind the legume paradox. So, what does a Delphi entails as a research method? A Delphi contains usually 4 phases. Phase number 1 is that you have to create a panel and a query. Phase number 2 is that you have to build an expert panel relying on your stakeholders. Phase number 3 is executing the Delphi in several rounds, if possible. And phase number 4 is the analysis and then the reporting of the Delphi result. In the True project, we deployed a web-based Delphi through an open source software called edelphi.org. It is basically an interactive platform and a survey based on the activity of the participants and the broader user community. Here, experts have been invited in a personal email, and finally, altogether, 80 experts accepted our invitation to participate in this Delphi exercise. So, like with every research method, there is pros and cons. So what are the main benefits of the Delphi? For example, social dominance in a Delphi study is relatively easily avoided, as a much broader plurality of viewpoints can emerge. It is also a benefit that we can build in feedback loops into the process so that we enable really a learning journey for the participant stakeholders. And finally, we can also use and rely on statistical methods here while we are aggregating opinions. There are also challenges of a Delphi study. Challenge number 1 is subjectivity. So it means that our results often reflect the subjective view of the summarizing experts. Challenge number 2 is what we call confirmation bias. It is actually a tendency that we select the arguments according to the summarizing experts' preconceptions. And challenge number 3 is the actual interest. In general, it's quite usual that researchers' interests are overrepresented compared to other stakeholders. So we need to be always very careful to reflect on these challenges. Delphi as a methodology was also unique because it led us to relatively unexpected results. So for example, we started this with an open question. Why are legume production and consumption are so low in Europe? And our 80 experts are basically all referred to what is usually described as a system lock-in in the literature, which is that value chain actors are quite limited in the uptake of legumes. How it is illustrated? The best it is illustrated that they say, for example, that production is very low because legumes are not competitive enough compared to other crops due to the lack of demand. But at the same time, they also say that consumption is also low because legumes are not attractive enough compared to the meat or other food products due to the lack of innovative products. So this paradox within the legume paradox is a real system lock-in. How do experts see the actual intervention points in this locked-in situation? There are 2 types. One is improving the profitability of legume production. This can be done via increased policy support of legume production, for example, through payments for positive environmental externalities or higher taxes on inorganic fertilizers. Or, for example, increased policy support of legumes compared to imported protein crops. This could be done by requiring imported protein crops to meet the same environmental standards. Another intervention point to improve the profitability is to actually improve the advisory system to provide more information and practical knowledge to farmers on how to produce legumes more efficiently. And finally, the profitability could be improved through novel breeds, potentially building on traditional, local, adapted varieties, which meet requirements of reliable yield, plant health, and adaptability to climate change. Experts also see a number of ways to increase the demand for legume-based products. For example, via creating novel products, both feed and food that meet consumer preferences, processed food, which is tasty and easy and quick to prepare, but also branding legume-based products as trendy and healthy to improve the attractiveness of such products. The demand could be also increased by co-creating and sharing new knowledge about the benefits of legumes on human and planetary health with the consumers. And finally, it's also important to include legumes in dietary recommendations at all policy levels. During this Delphi study, we asked our experts to assess 10 statements related to what we called the legume paradox. And all of them are outlining different policy scenarios. The assessments went along 2 aspects, probability and impact. By probability, we meant to assess what is the probability that a certain policy leads to change in the legume production and consumption. And by impact, we meant what kind of impact a certain policy could have on legume production and consumption. Based on the results, we managed to differentiate 3 main clusters with regards to this probability and impact scores, based on the assessment of the experts on the 10 specific policies. There are high potential policies with relatively high probability and impact scores. There are medium potential policies with medium probability and impact scores, and low potential policies with the lowest possible probability and impact. This Delphi study managed to identify 3 policy action areas and governance solutions with the highest potential to trigger change. Number 1 is the investment in agri-food and feed research and knowledge transfer that will increase the competitiveness of protein crops and legume-based food products. Number 2 is a ban on use of inorganic nitrogen fertilizer, which can create incentives for more legume production. And number 3 is diet and health and nutrition policies and public campaigns that could promote the inclusion of legumes in human diets and could make legumes much more visible and also probably increase imports for consumption. From these main insights on the favorable governance context, we generated a question. The question was actually, can we combine different policy instruments, for example, legal regulations or market-based incentives or product labeling, so that these combinations could add up to policy mixes? So in the second round of Delphi, we are now looking at how policy interactions and interdependencies can forge pathways towards legume-based food and feed systems in the coming 10 years. During this Delphi study, our experts also identified which are the policies with less potentialities. So we have here a cluster of policies with medium potentials. For example, here we have agriculture incentives within the Common Agriculture Policy that support farmers growing plant proteins. Also, with medium potential, experts believe there is the green direct payments within the CAP that actually helps the sustainability transition of the food and feed system. Similarly, climate change policies are there to help to reduce meat production and consumption, while at the same time increase legume cropping and decrease the emission from inorganic fertilizers. And finally, in this range of medium potential policies, experts identified public food procurement, which offers often more healthy options in food service markets and also help the shift towards legume-based diets. And also there are policies which, according to our experts, have very low potential to trigger change. Here we have the changing of the actual international trade agreements that would actually reduce EU's dependency on soybean imports. But we also have here all other policies that support legume production and consumption in Europe that actually also increases industrialized livestock production. And finally, we have here the provisioning of transparency of market data that would actually help to boost the legume supply chains. Experts believe that these policies have much less potentialities than the former ones. So, in the second round of the Delphi exercise, we ask our stakeholders to assess what would happen if certain policy instruments were introduced. How would that impact the sustainability of EU agriculture? How would that impact legume production and consumption in Europe? So, for example, we ask, imagine that by 2030, stricter environmental and climate regulations are applied on crop and livestock production in Europe. Imagine that the new measures combine legal restrictions on inorganic nitrogen use with a system of allowances for farmers. Or we ask their opinion about the abolition of the Common Agricultural Policy. Imagine that by 2030, a radical policy shift happens and therefore the EU stops all agricultural subsidies through the CAP. With this, I would like to invite every one of you to take part in forging these transition pathways together. So join us in this Delphi exercise. Write me and I will put you on the panel. And now let me introduce the most important transition path from my point of view. So for a sustainable food and feed value networks, we would require a much better integration of ecological health, nutrition aspects into the food and agriculture policies. Secondly, we would require public support for making the benefits, ecology, climate, health, nutrition, and so on, much more visible and promote the production and consumption of more legumes through, for example, public food procurement. And number 3, knowledge transfer and multi-actor collaborations, public-private partnerships that would enable a dynamic and much more harmonized mobilization of the value chain actors. Please get in contact with me if you want to be part of our Delphi panel. Thank you very much.